Tracy sat in her first-class seat, thirsty but patient. She pressed the call button and asked for a glass of water in her gentle, measured tone. In response, the flight attendant, Ms. Reynolds, briefly met her eyes before drifting away with a cool detachment. When Tracy repeated her request, the reply came out curtly, leaving her feeling as though she were an uninvited guest in her own luxurious space. Yet behind that dismissive act lay an unexpected twist. Tracy's quiet demeanor concealed the secret that her father owned the airline, a fact unknown to Ms. Reynolds and destined to upend the flight's ordinary course. Inside the cabin, soft engine hums and the clink of silverware painted a refined yet tense atmosphere. Outside, the busy runway whispered promises of distant journeys, stirring a mix of excitement and quiet pride in Tracy. Though this was her inaugural first-class experience, a hard-earned reward for her academic efforts, she chose to savor it silently, letting the serene ambiance and her favorite tunes fill the moments between service rounds. As the plane ascended and attendants began their courteous rounds, Tracy watched with subtle wonder as Ms. Reynolds engaged warmly with other passengers. A brief smile for a businessman here, a shared laugh with a sparkling-eyed traveler there. Yet when the attendant reached Tracy's row, the warmth vanished, replaced by an icy indifference. After setting a drink for an elderly gentleman nearby, she passed by without pause. Gathering her resolve, Tracy spoke up in her calm, polite manner. "Excuse me, may I have a glass of water, please?" The words, gentle yet insistent, momentarily broke the cabin's quiet routine. In reply, Ms. Reynolds offered a tight, measured smile and responded, "We'll get to you when we can," before moving on as if nothing more mattered. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from, and if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. Tracy frowned. It felt peculiar. She had just seen Ms. Reynolds efficiently serve several other passengers without any delay, yet she resolved to remain patient a little longer, thinking that perhaps the attendant was simply in a rush. Moments ticked by as other flight attendants moved gracefully through the cabin, checking in with first-class travelers, refilling drinks, and sharing light conversations. While Ms. Reynolds remained conspicuously absent from Tracy's row, glancing around in quiet disbelief, Tracy began to wonder if she was merely imagining things, until the situation repeated itself. Across the aisle, a man in his late 50s raised his hand ever so slightly, signaling for another drink. Without a moment's hesitation, Ms. Reynolds immediately acknowledged him, pouring a fresh glass of water as if following a well-rehearsed routine. A sharp pang tightened Tracy's chest at the sight. Seizing a moment of renewed courage, she waved gently as the attendant passed her row once more. "Excuse me, could I please get some water?" Ms. Reynolds didn't slow down this time. Her response was colder. "I told you we'll get to you when we can." And just like that, she was gone. Tracy's fingers curled tightly against her seat's armrest, a silent protest marking her polite persistence, her patient waiting, and the fact that she had asked not once but twice. But the truth was becoming unmistakable. This wasn't a mere oversight. It wasn't that the attendant was simply busy. Something else was at play. Surveying the cabin, Tracy noticed that a few passengers had observed the unfolding drama, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others deliberately averting their eyes. The silence among them was palpable, as if no one dared to question why a basic request for water was being blatantly ignored, leaving Tracy's stomach to twist with unease. Determined to find some clarity, Tracy reached for her phone and quickly typed a message to her father. "Dad, I asked for water twice. The flight attendant is ignoring me." She paused, staring at the screen for a brief moment before decisively tapping send. Although she wasn't sure how he could possibly intervene, the plane was already high in the air. She clung to a fragile hope. Almost immediately, her phone buzzed with a message. "What's your flight number?" In a flurry, she checked her ticket and sent the details back. Moments later, another message appeared. "Sit tight. Don't worry." But one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not even close. Tracy stared at her phone screen, reading her father's message again. Sit tight. Don't worry. He always knew how to handle things. How could he possibly manage things from thousands of miles away? A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face as she slipped the phone back into her bag, her fingers lightly drumming against the armrest. Though she was never one to make a scene, the injustice of the situation was beginning to eat away at her composure. One moment. Miss Reynolds continued her rounds with a deliberate precision, weaving between passengers as if orchestrating a carefully choreographed routine. Each time she passed by Tracy's row, her actions were marked by a crisp efficiency. Serving a perfectly poured glass of wine to a well-dressed woman one moment, then offering a small bottle of sparkling water to a man adorned in elegant cufflinks the next. There was no sign of hesitation, no trace of the warmth she had previously extended to others. Tracy's grip on the armrest tightened imperceptibly, the silent message resounding in her mind. Ms. Reynolds had chosen to withhold the same courtesy from her. A soft voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. "Are you okay?" Startled, Tracy turned to find a kindly older gentleman in a navy blazer seated beside her. His concerned eyes met hers as if seeking an unspoken truth. With a strained smile, she replied, "I'm fine." The man hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the flight attendant before he leaned in, his tone hushed and deliberate. "I saw what happened," he confided, adding quietly, "Careful, ignoring you on purpose, isn't she?" Tracy's throat tightened. The evidence was undeniable. "I think so," she murmured softly. The man sighed, a mix of disbelief and sympathy in his expression. "Unbelievable." He straightened in his seat and then offered, "Do you want me to say something?" For a fleeting moment, Tracy considered the idea. Perhaps another voice would finally force Ms. Reynolds to extend the proper courtesy. But as she scanned the cabin, she realized that most passengers were busy pretending nothing was amiss. A few had glanced in her direction before quickly averting their eyes. The silence was a heavy blanket, leaving her isolated in her struggle for fairness. After a long, measured pause, Tracy exhaled slowly. "No, it's okay," came the gentle reassurance from the man, though his frown betrayed his concern. He offered a sympathetic nod before returning to his quiet solitude. Tracy shifted in her seat, casting her eyes out the window at the endless blue sky, which seemed to mock her smallness in the vastness above. Despite her lifelong love of flying, in that moment she felt undesirably insignificant. Her phone vibrated again. "Stay where you are, I'll handle it." The message left her with a mix of hope and puzzlement. How could her father, so distant and removed from the current chaos, really fix this? In that brief, charged instant, she sensed that plans were already in motion and the tide was about to turn. But one thing was certain. Miss Reynolds had just made the biggest mistake of her career. Tracy placed her phone back in her bag, her mind racing. Her father's words resonated in her memory, always unwavering and precise. If he promised to fix things, then he would, no matter the distance. Yet, as she surveyed the cabin, uncertainty gnawed at her. How could he possibly intervene from thousands of miles away? Her gaze drifted to the front, where Ms. Reynolds was engrossed in animated conversation with another passenger, her polished smile a stark contrast to the cool indifference Tracy had experienced. Minutes slipped by as the cabin buzzed with activity. Attendants refilling drinks, passing around snacks, and exchanging courteous nods, while Tracy remained rooted in her seat, her heart pounding with both anticipation and mounting frustration. Despite her silent plea for acknowledgement, every time Ms. Reynolds passed her row, her eyes never met Tracy's, as if deliberately averting the connection. Determined to reclaim the courtesy that was so blatantly denied, Tracy finally summoned the courage to press the call button above her seat. A gentle chime echoed through the cabin, drawing the attention of a younger flight attendant named Fiona. Unlike the haughty presence of Ms. Reynolds, Fiona had been quietly navigating the background, perhaps wary of stepping on someone's toes. With a polite smile, Fiona approached and inquired, "Yes, miss, how can I help you?" After a brief hesitation, Tracy spoke up. "I asked for water a while ago. I never got it." Fiona's eyes widened slightly as she glanced over toward Miss Reynolds, who stood near the galley, still immersed in a light-hearted exchange with another passenger. The younger attendant's voice carried a trace of concern as she asked, "You weren't served?" Tracy's response was firm yet understated. "No, I asked twice." In that moment, Fiona's eyes betrayed a flicker of hesitation, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken injustice unfolding before her. With a swift pivot, she moved toward the galley, carefully stepping past the ever-present Ms. Reynolds. Tracy watched intently as Fiona reached out for a bottle of water, hope glimmering in her eyes for a moment of rightful service. But before she could grab it, Ms. Reynolds suddenly spoke. "Leave it." Her voice was quiet but sharp. Fiona froze. "She asked for water," Fiona said in a voice barely above a whisper. Ms. Reynolds didn't even look in her direction. "I said leave it." Tracy felt her stomach tighten as she watched the exchange. Her hands curled into fists in her lap. It wasn't just rudeness anymore. This was intentional. Fiona hesitated, then glanced back at Tracy. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but then, with a small nod, she turned away, walking back to the front of the plane empty-handed. Tracy's pulse quickened. She had been ignored again. Her fingers itched to reach for her phone to text her father and tell him it had gotten worse, but before she could, the intercom crackled to life. "Emails Reynolds, please report to the cockpit immediately." The flight attendant stiffened for the first time. Her expression faltered. Tracy could see it in her body language, the slight hesitation, the tension in her shoulders. Passengers glanced up, momentarily distracted by the announcement. Ms. Reynolds set down her tray and straightened her uniform before making her way to the front of the plane. Tracy followed her movements, her heartbeat steady but expectant. Her father had done something, and whatever it was, Ms. Reynolds wasn't going to like it. Miss Reynolds walked toward the cockpit with stiff, measured steps. Tracy could tell by the way she held her shoulders tight and rigid that she wasn't expecting good news. Tracy's fingers gripped the armrest of her seat as she watched the flight attendant disappear behind the cockpit door. A quiet murmur spread through the first-class cabin. The passengers might not have known exactly what was happening, but they knew something was wrong. The older man next to her leaned slightly toward her. "That wasn't a normal announcement," he said. Tracy nodded. "I don't think so either," she replied, shifting in her seat, her thoughts racing. What had her father done? Had he called the airline? Had he spoken to someone on the ground? How much power did he have to change things mid-flight? Several minutes passed. The first-class cabin was unusually quiet now. Even the passengers who had ignored her earlier seemed aware that something was off. Then the door to the cockpit opened. Ms. Reynolds stepped out, and Tracy could see the change in her face immediately. The confidence was gone. The smugness had vanished. Her usually sharp expression was now blank. No forced smile, no warmth. Nothing. She walked back toward the galley, but her movements weren't as smooth as before. They were stiff, hesitant. Tracy could almost see the weight pressing on her shoulders. A moment later, the intercom crackled again. "This is your captain speaking. We appreciate your patience during our flight today. If any passenger requires further assistance, our crew is here to ensure a comfortable journey for everyone." The words seemed ordinary, professional, but there was a tone beneath them, something unspoken. something meant for a specific person in the cabin. Tracy didn't move. She didn't need to. She waited. Ms. Reynolds reappeared in the aisle, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The warmth she had once shown the other passengers was gone. She stopped at Tracy's row, her jaw tight, her voice quieter than before. "I apologize for the delay," she said. The words forced. "Would you like some water now?" Tracy tilted her head slightly. Now she glanced down the aisle where some passengers were pretending not to listen, while others were outright staring. Even Fiona, the younger flight attendant, was watching carefully from a distance. Tracy turned back to Ms. Reynolds, her voice steady. "I asked for water a long time ago," she said. "Why are you offering it now?" A flicker of something crossed Ms. Reynolds' face. Frustration? Embarrassment? Tracy didn't let her off the hook. "You served everyone else," she continued, keeping her voice calm. "You ignored me even when I asked twice." Ms. Reynolds' throat bobbed slightly. It was a misunderstanding. Tracy let the silence sit between them for a moment, then finally she shook her head. "No, it wasn't." Miss Reynolds pressed her lips together. "Would you like the water or not?" Tracy held her gaze for a long second, then leaned back in her seat. "No, thank you." A few people shifted in their seats, murmuring under their breath. Miss Reynolds inhaled sharply through her nose, nodded once, then turned on her heel and walked away. Tracy didn't take her eyes off her as she disappeared toward the galley. Whatever had happened in that cockpit had shaken her. But this wasn't over yet, not even close. Tracy remained still, her heartbeat steady as she watched Miss Reynolds disappear back into the galley. The tension in the cabin was thick, stretching across the rows of seats like an invisible thread. Passengers who had ignored her earlier now exchanged uncertain glances, as if sensing that something much bigger was happening. The older man next to her let out a low chuckle. "Smart move," he muttered. Tracy didn't respond. She didn't feel like she had won anything, at least not yet. Her phone vibrated in her lap. She picked it up and saw her father's message. She apologized. Tracy's fingers hovered over the screen before she typed back, "I tried." It didn't sound real. A few seconds later, another message appeared. "Good. You don't have to accept fake apologies." Tracy exhaled slowly. He understood. He always did. But before she could put her phone away, another chime rang through the cabin. A different voice, calm, professional, came over the intercom. "Ms. Reynolds, please report to the front immediately." Tracy looked up. The passengers around her shifted again, their curiosity piqued. First, she had been called to the cockpit, now another announcement. This wasn't normal. Miss Reynolds reappeared, walking quickly, her posture stiff. She disappeared through the curtains leading to the front of the plane. Tracy tapped her fingers against her knee. She didn't know what was happening, but she could feel it. Something was unraveling. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The murmur of passengers filled the space, the tension lingering. Even the other flight attendants seemed uneasy, whispering among themselves near the galley. Then suddenly, the curtains parted, but this time it wasn't Ms. Reynolds who stepped out. It was the captain. The whispering stopped. The tall, broad-shouldered man scanned the cabin before settling his gaze on Tracy. His expression was neutral, but his eyes carried weight, authority, and understanding. He walked toward her row. Tracy sat up straighter, her breath caught in her throat. He stopped beside her seat, then spoke in a voice that was just loud enough for the passengers nearby to hear. "I want to personally apologize for the way you've been treated on this flight." A stunned silence followed. Tracy blinked, caught off guard. She wasn't expecting this. The captain continued, his voice firm but calm. "I've been made aware of the situation and I assure you it is being addressed," the captain said, but calm. He hesitated, then added, "This airline does not tolerate behavior like this." Tracy felt the weight of every passenger's gaze on her, but she kept her expression steady. The captain glanced toward the galley, where the flight attendant stood frozen. His gaze was sharp. "Ms. Reynolds will no longer be serving on this flight." A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. Tracy's stomach flipped. Did he just say that? Before she could process it, the captain straightened. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." He gave her a small nod, then turned and walked away, disappearing behind the curtain for a long moment. No one spoke. Then, from somewhere in the cabin, a slow, deliberate clap echoed. Tracy turned her head. The older man next to her smirked and gave her a single nod before clapping again, and then one by one other passengers joined in. Tracy didn't smile, but she felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just about water anymore. This was about what happened when people like Ms. Reynolds thought they could act without consequences, and right now, the entire plane had just witnessed what consequences looked like. The sound of clapping faded, but the shift in the cabin remained. Tracy felt it in the air. The way people were suddenly more aware, more attentive. The very passengers who had ignored what happened earlier were now stealing glances at her, whispering behind their hands. Some looked embarrassed, others seemed uncomfortable. No one had spoken up when Ms. Reynolds refused her water, but now that they knew who she was connected to, they were paying attention. Tracy didn't react. She simply exhaled and sat back in her seat. She wasn't here to make a scene. She had asked for something simple, respect, and now the very people who had treated her like she was invisible were forced to acknowledge her presence. The curtain at the front of the plane shifted, and Ms. Reynolds emerged. Tracy's breath slowed. She had expected the flight attendant to be furious, to hold her head high and pretend she had done nothing wrong. But the woman walking toward her wasn't the same one who had dismissed her earlier. Ms. Reynolds's face was pale. Her expression was blank. There was no arrogance, no authority in the way she carried herself. Her uniform, usually neat and crisp, looked slightly stiff now, as if it were weighing her down. She stopped beside Tracy's seat, standing in the aisle, gripping her hands together so tightly that her knuckles turned white. For the first time, she looked uncertain. Passengers were watching. Tracy tilted her head slightly, waiting. Ms. Reynolds took a slow breath. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, almost strained. I want to apologize for the way I treated you." Tracy didn't blink. The cabin was silent, every ear tuned into the conversation. Ms. Reynolds swallowed, forcing herself to continue. "I should have served you when you asked. I shouldn't have ignored you. It was unprofessional and it was wrong." Her voice wavered slightly on the last word. Tracy studied her carefully. There was a difference between an apology and a real apology. The first one was for show, the second one was felt. She wasn't sure which one this was yet. Tracy finally spoke, her tone calm. "You didn't just ignore me, you refused me." A flicker of something passed over Ms. Reynolds's face. Shame, regret. "I know," she admitted, barely above a whisper. "And I was wrong for that." Tracy kept her voice steady. "Why did you do it, Ms. Reynolds?" Her lips parted slightly, as if she wasn't expecting the question. Ms. Reynolds hesitated. A few passengers glanced at each other, waiting for her answer. Tracy didn't rush her. She wanted to see if Ms. Reynolds was willing to own up to it. Not just say she was sorry, but actually understand what she had done. Finally, the flight attendant exhaled, closing her eyes for half a second before looking at Tracy again. "I don't have a good excuse," she admitted. "I made an assumption about you and it was wrong. That was it. No excuses, no trying to shift the blame, just a truthful statement." Tracy let the words settle between them. She could see that saying them wasn't easy for Ms. Reynolds. A quiet beat passed before Tracy gave a slow nod. "Okay." Ms. Reynolds blinked. Tracy didn't say, "I forgive you." because that wasn't something that came instantly. That was something that had to be earned. She wasn't here to make her feel better, but she was here to make her think. Ms. Reynolds gave a stiff nod before stepping back. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the galley, disappearing once more. The weight in the cabin shifted again. Some passengers looked relieved. Others still avoided eye contact, unsure of what to do. Tracy reached for her phone and sent a quick message to her father. "I apologized, but I don't think this is over yet." A few seconds later, her screen lit up. "It's not." Tracy inhaled slowly, locking her phone. Whatever was coming next wasn't going to happen in the air. It was going to happen when they landed. Tracy adjusted in her seat, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened settle over her. The first-class cabin was still uncomfortably quiet, the tension lingering like a heavy cloud. People had watched Ms. Reynolds apologize, yet no one truly knew what to do with that moment. Some passengers looked at their screens, pretending they hadn't witnessed the exchange. Others kept stealing glances in her direction, their expressions unreadable. Tracy wasn't surprised. They had all seen what happened earlier but had chosen to stay silent. Now, when the consequences had finally reached Ms. Reynolds, they suddenly wanted to pay attention. She let out a slow breath, unlocking her phone again. Her father's last message stared back at her. "It's not." Her fingers hovered over the screen before she typed, "What did you do?" The response came within seconds. "I made a phone call." Tracy frowned slightly. A phone call that could mean anything. But she had a feeling it wasn't just a complaint to customer service. Her father never did things halfway. When he handled something, it was handled completely. She was about to respond when she noticed movement at the front of the cabin. The younger flight attendant, Fiona, hesitated near the galley before walking toward Tracy's row. She looked nervous, her hands clasped together as she approached. Tracy watched her carefully. Fiona stopped just beside her seat, lowering her voice so that only Tracy and the older man sitting next to her could hear. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened," she said softly. Tracy studied her, unsure of her intention. "You weren't the one who ignored me." Fiona's lips pressed together before she nodded. "No, but I saw it, and I should have said something," she swallowed. "I almost did." She trailed off, glancing toward the galley where Ms. Reynolds had disappeared. Tracy understood immediately. Fiona had been afraid to step in. Ms. Reynolds had authority over her, and calling her out could have easily backfired. Still, Tracy couldn't help but wonder if her father hadn't stepped in. Would Fiona have spoken up at all? Tracy kept her voice even. "Why are you saying this now?" Fiona shifted on her feet. "Because I was wrong too," she admitted. "I didn't ignore you, but I let it happen, and that's just as bad." There was something honest about the way she said it. It wasn't forced or rehearsed, like Ms. Reynolds' apology had been. Tracy nodded slightly. "Okay." Fiona hesitated before speaking again. "When we land, things might get intense." Tracy narrowed her eyes. "What do you mean?" Fiona exhaled, glancing around before lowering her voice even more. "I don't know exactly what your dad did, but the crew just got a message from corporate." She shifted uncomfortably. "Ms. Reynolds is being met at the gate by airline executives." Tracy's pulse quickened. Executives? That wasn't a simple disciplinary talk. That was serious. Fiona straightened, looking like she wanted to say more but was afraid to. Instead, she simply gave Tracy a small nod before stepping back toward the galley. Tracy's mind raced. Her father wasn't playing around. Whatever phone call he had made had reached the highest level of the airline, and if executives were involved, it meant one thing. This wasn't just about one bad flight attendant anymore. This was about the company itself. Her stomach tightened. She wasn't sure what was about to happen, but one thing was clear. Ms. Reynolds had no idea what was waiting for her when the plane landed. Tracy's grip tightened on her phone as she processed what Fiona had just told her. Executives were waiting at the gate. That meant her father's call had shaken something at the very core of the airline. It wasn't just about her being ignored anymore. It wasn't just about Ms. Reynolds' behavior. This had turned into something much bigger. Tracy turned her head slightly, catching a glimpse of the flight attendants near the galley. They were whispering to one another, their movements tense. Even those who had seemed indifferent before were now looking uneasy. She glanced at the older man beside her. He was watching the crew as well, his sharp gaze following every subtle shift in their behavior. "Something tells me your father doesn't mess around," he murmured. Tracy exhaled slowly. "He never does." The man smirked, nodding approvingly. "Good." Tracy's eyes flickered back to the galley, just in time to see Ms. Reynolds emerge once again. She walked slowly, her usual confident stride noticeably stiffer. The tension in her shoulders was clear now. Tracy felt the shift in power, but what she noticed most was the way the other flight attendants subtly stepped aside when she passed. Ms. Reynolds still held authority, but she was alone now. The support, the silent approval from her co-workers had vanished. She turned toward Tracy's row, and for a moment it looked like Ms. Reynolds was about to say something. But then she caught sight of a passenger still watching her, and she hesitated. Instead of stopping, she turned quickly and walked toward the galley again. Tracy wasn't sure if she had been about to apologize again, or if she had just wanted to justify herself. Either way, she had lost the moment. Another vibration from Tracy's phone pulled her attention away. A message from her father. "We land in 20 minutes. Stay in your seat when we taxi to the gate." Tracy's breath slowed. "Why?" she typed quickly. "What's happening?" His response was immediate. "Just wait, you see." Tracy swallowed. She wasn't sure what he had set into motion, but she knew better than to doubt him. Then the intercom crackled again, and the captain's voice came through, smooth and composed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent. Please make sure your seat belts are fastened and your tray tables are in their upright positions. We'll be landing shortly." A quiet shuffle went through the cabin as passengers adjusted themselves. Some stretched, some sighed, relieved that the flight was almost over. But Tracy didn't move. She could feel it now. This wasn't just a normal landing. Something was waiting for them at that gate. And Miss Reynolds. She was walking straight into it. The plane began its steady descent. The familiar hum of the engines shifted as the aircraft prepared to land. The sky outside was turning a soft shade of gold, the sun dipping lower on the horizon. Tracy barely noticed. Her thoughts were focused on what was waiting at the gate. She gripped the armrest lightly, keeping her eyes forward, though her mind raced with questions. What had her father done? Who exactly was waiting for them? What would happen to Miss Reynolds? A glance toward the galley told her that the flight crew was just as tense as she was. Ms. Reynolds stood near the beverage station, her back unnaturally straight, her hands gripping the counter. The other attendants kept their distance, speaking in hushed voices and throwing occasional glances in her direction. It was as if they knew she was in trouble, but weren't willing to step in to help. Tracy turned back to her phone, half expecting another message from her father, but there was nothing. He had told her to wait, and she knew better than to push for more information. The plane touched down smoothly, a soft jolt running through the cabin as the wheels met the runway. A few passengers clapped quietly, an old habit some people still had even on routine flights. Tracy, however, remained still. She could sense it. Something was coming. As the aircraft slowed, rolling toward the terminal, a voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. The local time is 5:42 p.m. Please remain seated until we have reached the gate and the seatbelt sign has been turned off. On behalf of our crew, we thank you for flying with us today." People shifted, unbuckling their belts despite the announcement, eager to stand and grab their bags. The first-class cabin was no different, except for the air of unease that still hung over it. Tracy's fingers drummed against her knee as she watched Ms. Reynolds turn to face the exit. Her posture was still stiff, but now there was something else in her expression, something Tracy hadn't seen before. Fear. A soft ding signaled the final approach to the gate. The plane came to a full stop, and for a second, everything was still. Then the front door opened, and two airline officials stepped onto the aircraft. Tracy recognized the type immediately, high-ranking executives. Their uniforms were crisp, their expressions unreadable, but the way they walked, the quiet authority in their movements, made it clear they weren't here for a routine check. Passengers murmured in confusion, some craning their necks to see what was happening. Even the first-class travelers who had barely paid attention before were now watching with interest. Ms. Reynolds straightened, schooling her features into something neutral, but Tracy could see the way her fingers twitched slightly at her sides. One of the executives, a man in his 50s with graying hair and a sharp, polished look, scanned the cabin briefly before his gaze settled on Ms. Reynolds. Ms. Reynolds stiffened. "Yes, sir," she said. The man glanced at his colleague, a woman with a clipboard in hand, and she nodded slightly before he continued. "You'll need to step off the aircraft with us immediately." A ripple of surprise moved through the first-class cabin. Some passengers exchanged glances, a few even whispered among themselves. Ms. Reynolds hesitated. I don't understand. Is there a problem?" The female executive, the one holding the clipboard, gave her a pointed look. "We'll discuss that in the terminal. Please gather your belongings and come with us." Tracy didn't move. She didn't blink. Ms. Reynolds's hands tightened at her sides. "I still have duties to finish before now, Ms. Reynolds." The man's voice left no room for argument. For a long moment, the flight attendant stood frozen. Then, with a visible swallow, she nodded stiffly and stepped toward the galley to grab her bag. Tracy's chest felt tight, though she wasn't sure why. She wasn't surprised. She had known this was coming, but the most shocking part was the silence. Not a single one of Ms. Reynolds's colleagues spoke up for her. None of them asked what was happening. None of them stepped forward to defend her. She was completely alone. Miss Reynolds's heels clicked lightly against the floor as she walked toward the exit. The executive stepped aside, allowing her to pass through the open doorway, and just like that, she was gone. For the first time since the plane had taken off, Tracy let out a slow breath. It was over, or at least this part was, because Tracy knew her father. And if Miss Reynolds thought this was the end of the consequences, she was wrong. The tension in the first-class cabin remained thick and unshakable even after Ms. Reynolds disappeared down the jet bridge. No one moved, no one spoke. The passengers who had quietly observed the situation unfold were still gripping their armrests, processing what they had just witnessed. Tracy did turn to watch Ms. Reynolds leave. She didn't need to. The flight attendant's fate had been sealed the moment she made the choice to treat her differently. This wasn't just about a single glass of water. It was about who had the power in the room. And right now, Ms. Reynolds had none. The flight attendants who remained on board quickly composed themselves, shifting back into their usual professional mannerisms, but the air between them was strained. They had spent the entire flight either ignoring Ms. Reynolds' behavior or silently enabling it. Now, as the doors to the terminal loomed ahead, it was clear that no one wanted to be caught on the wrong side of this situation. Tracy reached for her phone again. "She's gone." Her father's response was instant. "I know." Tracy blinked. He knew before she could type a response. Another message followed. "Stay in your seat. Security will escort you off the plane." Tracy frowned slightly. Security, that was unexpected. She didn't feel unsafe, but something told her her father wasn't taking any risks. He wasn't just handling this like an incident. He was handling it like an operation. A few minutes later, the soft ding of the seatbelt sign turning off echoed through the cabin. Passengers immediately shot up, reaching for their overhead bags, eager to exit the plane. But Tracy didn't move. She followed her father's instructions and stayed put. The older man who had been sitting beside her noticed. He gave her a knowing look before muttering, "Smart girl." She simply nodded. Then they arrived. 2 uniformed security officers stepped onto the plane, moving with quiet authority. Unlike the airline executives who had escorted Ms. Reynolds away, these men weren't here to handle corporate policy. They were here for protection. Passengers paused in their movements, staring as the officers scanned the cabin. One of them, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard, met Tracy's gaze before stepping forward. "Miss Tracy," he nodded slowly. "Yes," she replied. He gestured toward the exit. "We've been asked to escort you to the terminal." The whispers started instantly. People turned their heads in confusion, rippling through the cabin. Some passengers looked at each other, murmuring in hushed tones. The same people who had ignored her earlier were now fascinated by her presence. Tracy exhaled and calmly grabbed her small bag, slinging it over her shoulder. She stood, her movements steady, her expression unreadable, as she walked toward the front of the cabin. The other first-class passengers shifted awkwardly, parting to let her pass. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with quiet shame. They all knew why this was happening, and yet none of them had spoken up when it mattered. Tracy didn't spare them a second glance. She stepped off the plane, security walking beside her, their presence alone making it clear she was not just another passenger. The moment she entered the jet bridge, she saw them, a group of high-level airline executives waiting just beyond the terminal doors. Their suits were pressed, their expressions serious. But standing in the center of them all was her father. Tracy felt her pulse slow, steadying herself. He wasn't dressed like the others. There was no suit, no stiff posture. He stood with the kind of confidence that didn't need fancy titles or corporate jargon. The second he saw her, his expression softened, but only slightly. She walked toward him, and as she did, the airline executive stepped aside. Her father, Victor Belmont, extended his hand in a brief but firm motion, and Tracy immediately placed hers in his. That simple gesture was enough. She didn't have to say anything. She was safe. She was heard. But more importantly, this wasn't over. Not yet. Tracy's fingers curled around her father's hand for only a moment before he gave it a small, reassuring squeeze. No words were exchanged, yet they didn't need to be. His presence alone was enough to tell her everything. He had been watching. He had been waiting. And now he was here to finish what he started. She released his hand as he turned to the group of airline executives surrounding them. There were 4 of them, 3 men and 1 woman, all dressed in sleek business attire, their faces carefully composed. Despite their neutral expressions, Tracy could see the nervous energy beneath their polished appearances. Her father's gaze swept across the group before he spoke, his voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I assume you all understand why we're standing here right now," he said. The executives stiffened slightly, glancing at each other. The man standing closest to him, a middle-aged executive with neatly combed silver hair, cleared his throat. Before responding, "Mr. Belmont, we received your call. The situation is being handled internally." Victor Belmont's expression didn't change. "Handled," he interrupted, his voice still dangerously calm. "I didn't come here to hear about your review process." The executives exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear that none of them were prepared for this kind of confrontation, not face to face, not with him. Tracy knew exactly why her father wasn't just a powerful businessman. He wasn't just someone who owned a major stake in the airline. He was someone who built his empire from the ground up. Every industry he touched, aviation, technology, infrastructure, had been shaped by his presence. His name wasn't just respected, it was feared by those who underestimated him. And right now, These executives were realizing their mistake. The female executive, who had remained silent until now, finally stepped forward. She adjusted the folder in her hands and spoke with the careful precision of someone who knew they were on thin ice. "Mr. Belmont, we understand the severity of this incident. We've already begun taking steps to ensure this does not happen again." Victor Belmont tilted his head slightly. "And what steps would those be?" he asked. The woman cleared her throat. "Ms. Reynolds has been placed on immediate suspension pending termination. We will also be conducting a re-evaluation of our first-class training procedures and will be implementing mandatory bias training for all flight crew members moving forward." Tracy studied their faces carefully. They were offering solutions, but not because they wanted to, because they had to, because they knew that this was no longer just a simple complaint from a passenger. This was a public relations disaster waiting to happen. Her father exhaled through his nose, his sharp gaze locking onto them. "That's a start," he said, "but it's not enough." The executives tensed. The silver-haired man hesitated before asking, "What else do you expect, sir?" Tracy already knew the answer before her father even spoke. "Accountability," he said, "and not just from one flight attendant, from your entire leadership team." A heavy silence fell over the group as the executives looked visibly uncomfortable. Now this was no longer about Ms. Reynolds. This was about them. Victor Belmont continued, his voice measured and controlled. "Let me be very clear. I have invested millions into this airline. I have sat at the same tables as your board members. I have ensured that your company remains profitable, efficient, and respectable." He let the words hang in the air before delivering the final blow. "And yet my daughter was humiliated by someone who believed she didn't deserve a basic level of human respect." Tracy felt a chill roll through her spine at the cold authority in his tone. The executives had no argument. They knew there was nothing they could say to justify what had happened. Her father took a slow step closer, his presence alone making them straighten. "So, let's make something clear. This isn't just about one bad employee. It's about the culture you've allowed to exist on your aircraft." The silver-haired executive swallowed visibly. We understand, Mr. Belmont. Victor Belmont held up a hand, stopping him. "No, you don't understand, but you will." He turned slightly, glancing toward a man who had been standing just behind the executives. A lawyer, one of his lawyers. The executive's face turned slightly pale. Now they understood. Victor Belmont looked back at them. "You'll be receiving a full legal statement by the end of the day. It will outline the corrective actions I expect from this airline, not just for my daughter's case, but for every passenger who has been discriminated against under your watch." The silence was deafening. Tracy felt the air shift. The way power was changing hands. This wasn't just about Ms. Reynolds anymore. This was about fixing the system. Her father looked at her, then his expression softened just slightly. "Are you ready to go?" he asked. Tracy nodded, gripping the strap of her bag. "Yeah." Victor Belmont turned back to the executives one last time. His final words were simple, but they carried the force of a storm. "Fix your airline or I will." Then, without another word, he placed a hand on Tracy's back and led her away. Past the executives, past the murmuring airport staff, past the bystanders who had been watching in stunned silence. Tracy didn't look back. She didn't need to, because she already knew this wasn't the end of the story. This was only the beginning. Tracy walked beside her father, matching his steady pace as they left the cluster of executives behind. Even as they moved further away, she could feel the weight of their stares pressing into her back. They had never expected to be confronted like that. Not so directly. Not so publicly. Her father said nothing as they made their way toward the private exit of the terminal. His expression was calm, unreadable. His suit jacket rested neatly on his shoulders, His movements were controlled, as if nothing that had just happened had affected him. But Tracy knew better. His silence wasn't indifference, it was calculation. He had done exactly what he came here to do. Make sure they understood that this wasn't something they could sweep under the rug. And now he was already thinking about his next move. Tracy exhaled slowly, gripping the strap of her bag as she kept walking. The airport was buzzing with activity. Passengers rushing through terminals, announcements echoing overhead, families reuniting near baggage claim. But in their corner of the airport, things were different. Here, people watched them. Security personnel, airline staff, even a few bystanders who had overheard the confrontation. They all turned their heads as she and her father passed. Tracy knew why most of them weren't used to seeing a man like him. A man who didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. A man who walked into a room and forced everyone to listen. And then there was her, the girl who had sat in her seat and said nothing when she was ignored. The girl who had refused to accept a fake apology. The girl who had become the center of a problem the airline had tried to pretend didn't exist. Her phone buzzed in her hand, pulling her thoughts away from the noise around her. She glanced down and saw a message from an unknown number. "I don't expect you to respond, but I needed to say this. I'm sorry. And not because I got caught, but because I was wrong." Tracy stared at the screen for a long moment. She didn't need to ask who it was from. Ms. Reynolds. For a second, she considered ignoring it after everything that had happened. What did an apology even mean? But then she thought about what her father had said. Accountability. Tracy didn't believe in easy forgiveness, but she believed in growth. She quickly typed a response before she could second-guess herself. "I hope you never do this to anyone else." She hit send and locked her phone. That was all she had to say. Her father led her past security toward a sleek black car waiting just outside the private terminal entrance. The driver stood beside the vehicle, holding the door open and giving them a polite nod. Tracy slid inside first, settling into the leather seat as her father followed. Once the door shut, the noise of the airport faded instantly, replaced by the quiet hum of the car's air conditioning. For the first time since she had stepped onto that plane, she felt calm. Victor Belmont loosened his tie slightly before glancing at her. "Are you okay?" Tracy nodded. "Yeah, I think so." He studied her as if deciding whether he believed her or not. "You handled yourself well," he said with a slight smirk. "I didn't do much," Tracy replied. Victor Belmont gave a rare chuckle. "You did more than you think." He leaned back against the seat, looking out the window as the car pulled away from the airport, and added, "You forced people to see something they didn't want to see." Tracy considered that. She hadn't planned for any of this to happen. She had just wanted a glass of water. She had just wanted to be treated like everyone else. But instead, she became the reason people had to face something uncomfortable. Tracy glanced at her father. "What happens now?" He didn't hesitate. "Now we make sure it doesn't happen again." Tracy exhaled, feeling a strange sense of relief settle in her chest. Because for the first time since she boarded that flight, she knew that she wasn't just a passenger who had been mistreated. She was part of something bigger. And this was only the beginning of the changes that were coming. The city skyline blurred past as the car moved steadily through the evening traffic. Tracy sat back in her seat, her hands folded in her lap, trying to process everything that had happened in the past few hours. From being ignored on the plane to watching her father dismantle an entire corporate team in a single conversation. It still didn't feel real. Victor Belmont was scrolling through his phone, his face unreadable. She had seen that look before, the look of a man who was still working even when everything seemed finished. Tracy shifted slightly. "Are you really going to push for policy changes?" Her father didn't look up. "I don't push," he said simply. "I decide." She raised an eyebrow. "So? What's the plan now?" He looked at her. "What do you think the plan should be?" Tracy hesitated. She wasn't expecting that question. Her father was a strategist, a businessman. He was used to handling things his way. He wasn't the type to ask for opinions unless he genuinely wanted them. She exhaled, gathering her thoughts. "This isn't just about one bad flight attendant," she said. "You said it yourself. This is about the culture of the airline." Her father nodded slightly, waiting. Tracy continued. "Ms. Reynolds won't fix it. There are other people like her working on other flights, making people feel small, like they don't belong." He didn't interrupt. "So if you really want to fix this, you can't just punish one person. You have to force the airline to change." Victor Belmont's gaze sharpened. Tracy bit the inside of her cheek, thinking. Then it hit her. "You control a percentage of their shares, right?" Her father gave a small, approving nod. 14%. Tracy sat up straighter. "That's enough to have a voice. Enough to demand a change in leadership if they don't take this seriously." A small smirk tugged at the corner of Victor Belmont's mouth. "Go on." Tracy's confidence grew. "You make them commit to real reforms, bias training, stricter oversight, a way for passengers to report discrimination in real time. And you don't let them do it quietly. You make them announce it publicly so they can't back out later." She paused, then added, "And if they don't?" Her father set his phone down. "Then I make an example out of them." Tracy swallowed. She had always known her father was powerful, but watching him work up close was different. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a force. "Are they going to fight it?" she asked. Victor Belmont exhaled through his nose. "At first, yes. They'll try to negotiate, pretend they're making changes when they're really stalling. That's what corporations do when they think the problem will go away on its own." He leaned back against the seat. "But they won't expect me to push this far, and they definitely won't expect that it's coming from you." Tracy frowned. "Me?" she asked. Her father nodded. "This fight started with you. If I force the airline to change, it'll look like a power move, a business deal. But if you stand up and say something, it becomes a message." Tracy's pulse quickened. "You mean publicly?" Victor Belmont studied her carefully. "Do you want to?" he asked. She hesitated. Did she? Tracy had never been the type to seek attention. She was comfortable staying in her lane, doing her own thing. But now, after everything that had happened, she wasn't sure she could go back to being quiet. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been dismissed, ignored, treated like they didn't belong. Tracy took a slow breath. "If I speak up, will it actually change anything?" Her father's expression was serious. "Only if you mean it," he replied. Tracy thought about Ms. Reynolds, about the way the passengers had pretended not to notice, about the way the airline executives had only acted because they were afraid of your father. She thought about how easy it would have been for none of this to happen, and then she thought about what would happen if she walked away. Now, her fingers curled into a fist. "I want to do it," she said firmly. Her father nodded, a quiet approval in his eyes. "Then let's make them listen." The car moved steadily through the city, its engine humming softly beneath them. Tracy's mind was racing, but her body felt still, almost weightless. She had made a decision, one that could change more than just her own life. Speaking up meant stepping into a space she had never occupied before. It meant becoming the face of a problem that many people wanted to pretend didn't exist. It meant confronting the silence. Victor Belmont tapped his fingers lightly against the armrest, deep in thought. Tracy could tell he was already working through the next steps in his mind, mapping out every move before the airline even had a chance to react. She shifted in her seat. "How do we start?" she asked. He looked at her, studying her for a moment before answering. We control the narrative, he said simply. We don't wait for them to spin it into something smaller than it is. We get ahead of them. Tracy nodded, waiting for him to continue. Her father picked up his phone, scrolling for a second before showing her the screen. It was an email draft addressed to a national news outlet with the subject, Passenger Discrimination Incident Statement. Statement from Tracy Belmont. Her breath caught. You're already drafting a press statement? Victor Belmont gave her a pointed look. You think they aren't? Tracy exhaled. He was right. The airline was probably already working on their own version of events, crafting words that would make them seem proactive, while minimizing what had actually happened. She leaned closer, scanning the text he had written. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't dramatic. It was factual, clear, and impossible to ignore. It detailed what had happened on the flight, how Ms. Reynolds had deliberately refused her service, how the situation had escalated to the point where executives had to get involved, but most importantly, it outlined the systemic issue, the culture within the airline that had allowed this behavior to exist in the first place. It ended with a single sentence that sent chills down Tracy's spine. This is not an isolated incident. And if this airline is truly committed to serving all passengers equally, then it is time for them to prove it. Tracy pulled back slightly, letting the weight of those words settle in her chest. Her father watched her reaction. This statement will make waves, he said. It will get people talking. Tracy knew what he wasn't saying. It would also make her a target. Not everyone would want to hear this. Some people would call it an overreaction. Some would say it was just one bad employee and not a reflection of anything bigger. Others, the worst kind of people, would try to twist the story, make it seem like she had deserved it somehow. Her stomach tightened, but she refused to let fear be the thing that stopped her. She nodded, her voice steady. Send it. Her father didn't hesitate. He pressed send. It was done. Tracy let out a slow breath, but before she could fully process it, his phone buzzed in his hand. Her father glanced down, his lips twitching slightly. That was fast. Tracy raised an eyebrow as he turned the screen toward her. The airline's CEO was calling. Tracy's pulse jumped. The CEO, not an assistant, not a board member, but the head of the entire airline. Her father gave her a knowing look before answering the call, putting it on speaker. A deep, forced, and professional voice greeted, I was just about to reach out to you. Her father smirked slightly. You're a little late. There was a slight pause on the other end of the line before the CEO continued. We've been reviewing the situation. I want to personally apologize to Tracy. What happened on that flight was unacceptable. Tracy stared at the phone, but she said nothing. This wasn't the moment to accept an apology. It was the moment to listen. Her father leaned back against the seat, and the CEO cleared his throat. We've already started disciplinary actions against Ms. Reynolds. Her father cut in smoothly. Firing her isn't enough. Another pause. Excuse me? Her father's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it. Now you're not going to fix this by making one flight attendant the scapegoat. This isn't about her. This is about your entire airline. The CEO exhaled slowly. We understand that changes need to be made, and I assure you, we are committed to... Tracy interrupted suddenly, her voice firmer than she expected. Silence. It was the first time she had spoken, and she felt the weight of it immediately. She wasn't just the passenger who had been ignored anymore. She was the one demanding action. The CEO hesitated before responding, his tone shifting slightly. Tracy, I understand you're upset, he said. She replied. This isn't about how I feel, she paused, then added. It's about how many other people this has happened to. How many times your employees have done this before and gotten away with it. Another pause followed. Her father smirked. She had caught him off guard. Tracy didn't let him recover. If you really mean what you're saying, then put it in writing. Announce the changes, make them public, hold your own employees accountable. Not just when a CEO's daughter is watching, but every day. There was a long silence on the other end of the call. Tracy could almost hear the gears turning in the CEO's head, weighing the risk of ignoring her versus the risk of agreeing. Finally, he spoke. "I'll have my team draft a public statement," he said carefully, "and I'll meet with our board to discuss implementing stronger oversight on our crew policies." Tracy glanced at her father. His face was unreadable, but she could see it in his eyes. He was impressed. Tracy turned back to the phone. "Not good enough," the CEO sighed, clearly frustrated. "Then what do you want?" Her heartbeat pounded, but she didn't hesitate. "Accountability," she said. "Not just for the employees, but for leadership too. If something like this happens again, it shouldn't take the CEO's daughter for you to care about it." Her father smiled slightly. There was another pause before the CEO finally relented. "Fine," he said, his voice tight. "We'll make the changes publicly, and we will ensure this never happens again." Tracy exhaled slowly. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Her father gave her a nod before ending the call. For the first time since she had stepped onto that plane, Tracy felt something shift inside her. She wasn't just someone who had been mistreated anymore. She was someone who had changed something, and she knew without a doubt that her voice had power. This wasn't just the end of a bad flight. This was the beginning of something bigger. The call ended with a quiet beep, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the car like an unspoken truth. Tracy sat back in her seat, her fingers still curled around the edge of her phone, her pulse steady but heavy. Victor Belmont placed his phone on the console between them, exhaling as he drummed his fingers lightly against the leather armrest. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he glanced at her. "How do you feel?" he asked. Tracy thought about it. The easy answer would be relieved, but was that really the truth? She had done something most people never got the chance to do. She had forced real change. The airline had no choice now. They would follow through, not because they wanted to, but because they had been backed into a corner. Because she and her father had left them no other option. But at the same time, she knew this wasn't the end. Tracy turned her head to look out the window, watching the city lights blur past. "I don't know yet," she admitted softly. Her father nodded, as if he expected that answer. "Good," he said simply. "That means you're thinking." Tracy let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head. "You really don't like easy answers, do you?" he smirked. No silence stretched between them again, but it was different this time. Not tense, not uncertain, just full. Tracy felt something settle in her chest. Not relief, not satisfaction, but something stronger. Purpose. She had gone from being a girl sitting quietly in her seat, being ignored and feeling powerless, to someone who had forced $1 billion corporation to face its own failures. She hadn't done it alone. Her father's influence had been the key that cracked the door open, but she had walked through it herself. That mattered. That was real. Her phone vibrated again, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced down and saw a flood of notifications lighting up her screen. The news had already broken. CEO of major airline announces new discrimination policy after incident with passenger. We will do better. Airline under fire after passenger mistreatment sparks outrage. One passenger refused to stay silent. Now the whole industry is watching. Tracy swallowed, her fingers tightening around the device. She had known this would happen. The moment her father sent that statement, the moment she spoke up on that call, the story had taken hold. People were already talking about it, and soon they would be talking about her. The idea made her stomach tighten, but she forced herself to take a breath. This was what she wanted, wasn't it? Not attention, not fame. Change. She tapped on one of the articles, scrolling past the headline, past the corporate PR statements, past the official apologies. Then she saw something she hadn't expected. Comments. Thousands of them. Tracy hesitated for half a second before reading. I had a similar experience on a flight last year. I was ignored, treated like I didn't belong, but I didn't have the power to do anything about it. This girl did what so many of us wish we could. Finally, someone is holding these airlines accountable. It's about time. It's sad that it took someone with influence to make them care, but at least now they have to. Some were supportive, some were angry, some were skeptical, questioning if this would really change anything. Tracy didn't know the answer to that yet, but she knew one thing. People were listening, and that meant she had a choice. She could let this moment pass, let it be just another story that fades in a few weeks. Or she could make sure the conversation didn't end here. Her father must have sensed what she was thinking because he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. What happens next is up to you. Tracy turned to face him, her heart steadying. She had never planned for this. She had never imagined herself in this position. But now that she was here, she realized something. She didn't just want change. She was ready to fight for it. She exhaled and gave her father a small, determined nod. We make sure they don't forget. Victor Belmont's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. Then let's get to work. As the car continued down the road, the city lights flashing past, Tracy realized something. This had started with a glass of water. A simple request, a moment of disrespect, an act of powerlessness, but it had become so much more. And now, she wasn't powerless anymore. This content teaches us that every small act of injustice can spark change when one has the courage to speak up, even if it seems insignificant at first. It shows that being ignored or mistreated should not be accepted, and that the power of accountability can transform personal pain into a catalyst for systemic reform. Tracy's experience reminds us that silence in the face of discrimination only perpetuates a toxic culture, while standing up, even as a single voice, can expose deeper flaws within an institution. Her journey also emphasizes the importance of support from those with influence, as her father's decisive intervention not only validated her experience, but also pressured the organization to address long-standing issues. Furthermore, it highlights that change requires persistence, transparency, and the willingness to challenge established power structures. Ultimately, the lesson here is that every individual deserves respect, and by uniting personal integrity with the pursuit of justice, one can drive meaningful, lasting change that benefits not just a single person, but society as a whole. What are your thoughts on what transpired? Do you believe the airline handled the situation appropriately? Share your perspective in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another compelling story.